In the luxurious glass-walled boardroom bathed in cold light, my husband shoved the asset division papers in front of me, curling his lips into a smug smile. Everything is mine now. You're leaving with nothing. His mother sat beside him, her eyes gleaming with triumph, as if they had already won long ago. But I simply adjusted my white suit, hiding a cold smile at the corner of my lips, because no one in that room knew. The person who was truly about to lose everything was not me. Before we begin, I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Your city, your country. I love knowing who's in this community. A quick note. This story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and educational purposes. Any similarity to actual names or places is coincidental, but the message it carries is one worth holding on to. Every morning my husband reminded me that I was nothing. He never said it directly. Marcus was too polished for that, too practiced in the particular art of making someone feel small without leaving fingerprints. It was in the way he looked through me when he walked into a room, the way he spoke over my head to his mother, the way he referred to my job at the county records office as Tegan's little filing hobby whenever his business associates called the house. This particular Tuesday morning was no different. I was standing at the kitchen counter when he came downstairs, already dressed in the charcoal suit he saved for important meetings. He walked past me to the coffee maker without a word, poured himself a cup I had already brewed, and sat down at the far end of the 12-seat dining table that had belonged to my grandmother. He didn't know that. He thought it came with the house. There were a lot of things Marcus didn't know. His mother, Eleanor, was already seated when I carried my own coffee to the table. She had the particular posture of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the appearance of effortless superiority, spine-straight chin, lifted eyes moving over me, the way they might move over a piece of furniture that had been placed in the wrong room. "You're wearing that blouse again," she said. Not a question, a verdict. "Good morning, Eleanor," I said. She turned back to her phone. Marcus was scrolling through emails, one hand wrapped around his coffee mug, the other swiping with the focused intensity he reserved for anything that wasn't me. After a moment, he looked up with the expression I had come to think of as his announcement faced the slight lift of the chin, the preloaded smile. "Got confirmation this morning," he said to his mother rather than to me. "The Meridian Group is moving forward. 3 new properties under management by end of quarter." He leaned back in his chair. "That's another 4 million in assets under our portfolio." Eleanor made a sound of approval. "That's my son." I wrapped both hands around my mug and said nothing. This was the part Marcus enjoyed most, I had learned. Not just the success, but the telling of it. The performance of it in rooms where I was present but functionally invisible. He had been managing 22 luxury residential properties across the Tampa Bay area for nearly 4 years, and in that time, he had spoken about the business at every dinner table, every family gathering, every casual Tuesday morning breakfast, as though he were narrating the rise of an empire. In a way, he was. He just didn't know whose empire it was. "Tegan." He said my name the way someone might say the name of a minor inconvenience. "Weren't you supposed to leave early today? Something about reorganizing file storage at your office?" "I have a regular shift," I said. 8:30. He glanced at Eleanor. A small exchange, barely perceptible. The kind that married couples develop over years, except theirs wasn't the language of partnership. It was the language of shared dismissal. "Right," Marcus said, returning to his phone. "The filing job." I took a sip of coffee. My official title was Records Processing Specialist Level 2 at the Hillsborough County Property Appraiser's Office. I had held the position for 4 years and 8 months, which meant I had 11 weeks left before I reached the 5-year mark stipulated in the trust document my father had drafted the winter before he died. 11 weeks. 47 days, to be precise. I had been counting since the day I signed those papers. Eleanor set down her phone and folded her hands on the table in the way that signaled she was about to say something she had been rehearsing. "I spoke with the Hargrove woman yesterday," she said. "Her daughter just made senior associate at a firm downtown, youngest in the office." She paused. Some people simply have the drive for real achievement. I looked at her. That's wonderful for her, I said. The silence that followed was the kind Eleanor was skilled at constructing, full of implication, architecturally precise. She had a talent for making statements that required no follow-up because the damage was already done in the original delivery. Marcus pushed back his chair and stood buttoning his jacket. I'll be home late. The Meridian dinner runs until 9. He picked up his phone, his keys, his portfolio. He moved through the kitchen the way he moved through all of it, like a man who owned everything he could see. He paused at the door to the hallway and looked back at me for the first time all morning. Try not to file anything in the wrong drawer today, he said. Then he was gone. Eleanor followed a few minutes later, coffee in hand heels, precise on the marble floors that had been installed by my grandfather in 1989. I sat alone at the long table. Outside the kitchen window, the grounds of the Caldwell estate stretched wide and green in the early morning light. The east garden where Arthur spent his Tuesday mornings. The long drive lined with live oaks that my mother had planted the year I was born. The fountain that my father had imported from a vineyard in Tuscany because my mother had laughed at a photograph of it in a magazine and said it was the most ridiculous thing she had ever seen, and she loved it completely. Marcus thought the fountain was original to the property. He thought a great many things that were not true. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and placed it in the drying rack. Then I picked up my bag from the hook beside the pantry door, checked that the red folder was still inside, and walked to the front entrance. My phone buzzed once as I reached the door. A single message from a number saved under a contact name that looked like a routine calendar reminder to anyone who might glance at the screen. It read, Phase 3 is ready. The loop closes in 47 days. I read it twice. Then I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket, opened the front door, and stepped out into the morning. 47 days. After 5 years, 47 days felt like nothing at all. The drive to the county office took 22 minutes on a good morning. I had made it so many times over the past 4 years and 8 months that my hands knew the route without instruction left on Bayshore, right on Morrison, the long stretch of Kennedy Boulevard, where the live oaks grew close enough to the road that their branches touched overhead and turned the morning light into something cathedral-like and diffuse. I had come to think of those 22 minutes as the only part of the day that truly belonged to me. No Marcus, no Eleanor, no performance required. This particular morning, my mind drifted back the way it often did when the road was quiet and the radio stayed off. 5 years ago, almost to the week. The memory came the way it always did, not in sequence, but in fragments. The smell of my father's study old wood and leather, and the faint trace of the pipe tobacco he had given up 15 years earlier, but whose ghost still lived in the walls. The sound of rain against the tall windows. My mother's hands folded in her lap, very still the way they got when she was working hard to stay composed. And my father's voice measured and careful, the way it always was when he was saying something that cost him something to say. We need to talk to you about what happens after we're gone. I had been 26 years old. It was the kind of sentence that rearranges the architecture of a conversation without warning, and for a moment I had simply looked at him, trying to locate the correct response somewhere in the space between us. You're not going anywhere, I had said. My father had smiled, the particular smile he reserved for moments when he found me both endearing and slightly beside the point. Tegan, we're in our 60s. We're not sick. But we're also not foolish enough to believe that preparation is the same as pessimism. He had slid a document across the desk toward me. Read the first 3 pages. The Caldwell Family Legacy Trust. Established under Florida statute, administered by Arthur Reeves, formerly of the United States District Court for the Middle District of Florida. I had read it twice. Then I had looked up at my parents. You're giving me everything, I said. We're protecting everything, my mother corrected gently. There's a difference. The trust was structured around a single condition. For a period of 5 years from the date of activation, the sole beneficiary, meaning me, was required to maintain independent employment, live without accessing Caldwell family assets, and make no public claim to the Caldwell name or estate. At the end of the 5-year period, full control of all assets transferred unconditionally. There was also a secondary clause, one my father had added almost as an afterthought, though I would come to understand that nothing my father did was ever truly an afterthought. In the event of the death of both trustees prior to the end of the 5-year period, Arthur Reeves was authorized to activate the trust immediately under emergency provisions, with the timeline running from the date of activation rather than the date of the trustees' deaths. Why, I had asked. Not why the trust. I understood the trust. Why the 5 years? Why the condition? My father had been quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the windows with sudden urgency. "Because Marcus is going to move the moment we're no longer here to stop him," he said finally. "And I need you to be untouchable before that happens. I need you to have built something of your own, something he can't reach, something that proves to any court in this country that you understood the value of what you were inheriting long before you inherited it." He paused. "And I need to know," he said more quietly, "that you can survive without the Caldwell name, because there may come a time when survival is exactly what's required." I had signed the papers that evening. My mother had cried briefly and then stopped and then squeezed my hand very hard and didn't let go for a long time. 3 weeks later, they were dead. The memory of the accident itself was not something I revisited willingly. It existed in my mind the way a burn scar exists on skin, present, permanent, and too sensitive for casual contact. What I remembered most clearly was not the phone call from the hospital, not the waiting room, not the arrangements that followed. What I remembered most clearly was the silence. The specific silence of a house where the people who had always been there were suddenly permanently not. Arthur had come to see me 2 days after the funeral. He had sat across from me in my father's study, in the chair my father used to occupy, and he had looked at me for a long time before he spoke. "The trust activates today," he had said. "Under the emergency provisions, the 5-year clock starts now." I had nodded. "There's something else." He had chosen his words carefully, the way men do when they are delivering information they wish they did not have. "The accident is being investigated as a standard vehicular incident. The other driver ran a red light. That's the official finding." He paused. "But your father had an automatic backup system on his phone, cloud-based, encrypted. It took me some time to locate the account and considerably longer to work through the security layers he built around it." I had gone very still. "I haven't listened to all of it," Arthur said. "That's not my place. But I listened to enough to know that the night of the accident, your father made a phone call." His voice remained even professional, the voice of a man who had spent decades in courtrooms delivering difficult truths without flinching. "Marcus was on that call, Tegan. He knew what was happening, and he made a choice." The drive to the office, the tunnel of live oaks on Kennedy Boulevard, the morning light coming through in long, angled shafts. I blinked and I was back in the present, both hands on the wheel, the county building visible 2 blocks ahead. I thought about what Arthur had said to me that day, and I thought about the 47 days remaining on the trust clock, and I thought about the red folder in my bag and the USB drive I had not yet opened sitting in the locked drawer of my nightstand at home. Not yet, I had told myself every night for 3 weeks since Arthur had given it to me, not until I was ready. I pulled into the parking lot, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet of the car. The clock was still running, and so was I. I picked up my bag and walked into the building where my husband filed his fraudulent paperwork under the name of the wife he believed had nothing to do the job he had laughed at for nearly 5 years. The irony had never gotten old. There are people in this world who are very good at being liked. Marcus Caldwell was one of them. I had understood this from the beginning. From the first evening he walked into the fundraiser where we met, the way he moved through a crowded room with the specific confidence of someone who had never once doubted his welcome. He was tall, well-dressed, fluent in the language of ambition that certain circles speak exclusively. He laughed at the right moments. He remembered names. He asked questions that made people feel interesting. I had liked him too in the beginning. My father had not. I was pulling up the morning's processing queue at my desk when the memories surfaced the way the uncomfortable ones always did, without invitation, and with complete clarity. I had been staring at a property transfer document filed under the name of one of Marcus's shell companies, and something about the particular arrangement of the signatures on the page had taken me back 4 years to a Saturday afternoon in my father's study 3 months before the wedding. My father had asked to meet with Marcus alone. He had not told me what the meeting was about beforehand, and Marcus had not mentioned it afterward until I asked directly. Even then, his answer had been brief and carefully constructed in the way that Marcus constructed most things that made him uncomfortable. "Your father wanted to get to know me better," he had said. Standard future father-in-law territory. It was not until after my parents died, when Arthur and I had spent long evenings going through my father's papers, that I found the notes. My father had kept a legal pad on his desk during important conversations, a habit from his years building the Caldwell portfolio when every meeting had stakes worth documenting. The notes from his meeting with Marcus covered 4 pages in my father's precise architectural handwriting. I had memorized them. The meeting had begun cordially enough. My father had offered coffee. Marcus had accepted. They had talked about the Tampa real estate market, about Marcus's position at the property management firm, where he worked at the time, about his professional ambitions. My father had listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, made his notes. Then he had set down his pen and looked at Marcus directly. "I'd like to speak frankly," my father had written, quoting himself. I told him I had looked into his finances. Marcus's debts, as my father had discovered through channels I preferred not to examine too closely, were significant. Not the ordinary debts of a young professional building a career. Something larger and considerably more dangerous. $3,200,000 owed to a private lending operation out of Miami that operated in the specific gray zone between aggressive finance and organized intimidation. The debt had been accumulating for 2 years, the product of a series of investment decisions that Marcus had described to mutual acquaintances as calculated risks and which had been, by any objective measure, catastrophic losses. The lenders had been patient. Their patience had a deadline attached to it. My father had laid this out plainly, sitting across from the man his daughter intended to marry, and Marcus had not denied it. He had, according to the notes, smiled. "He asked me for a loan," my father had written. The handwriting on this line was slightly different from the rest. The letters pressed harder into the page. $3.5 million. He framed it as a business partnership, an investment in the family's future. My father had declined. Not gently, not with the diplomatic softening that characterized most of his professional refusals. He had declined in the specific language he reserved for situations that required absolute clarity, and then he had gone further. I told him I intended to restructure the family trust. My father had written, in such a way that no asset, no property, no investment account, and no income stream associated with the Caldwell name would ever be accessible to him directly or indirectly, under any circumstances, for as long as he lived. The next line was underlined twice. He kept smiling the entire time. I had thought about that line many times in the years since, the smile that didn't move when everything underneath it was rearranging itself into something harder and colder and far more dangerous. The smile of a man who had already decided on a different solution to his problem and was simply waiting for the conversation to end so he could begin implementing it. Marcus had left the meeting, returned home, and told me it had gone well. 6 weeks later, my parents were dead. I looked at the property transfer document on my screen. The signature at the bottom was Marcus's, the same signature I had watched him practice once on a cocktail napkin at a charity dinner, working to make it look more authoritative. The transfer was for a 2-bedroom unit in a mid-rise on Harbor Island valued at $640,000, moved from the Caldwell Legacy Trust, LLC, to a subsidiary account that Marcus had established 18 months ago without any board authorization. Without, more precisely, my authorization, because the board of the Caldwell Legacy Trust in its entirety was me. I opened the flagging system and marked the document, the 47th flag in the past 11 months. Each one a thread in the rope Marcus was methodically, efficiently, and completely unknowingly braiding around his own future. My father had seen him coming from 3 months out. I had simply had 5 years to prepare for the arrival. I saved the file, closed the screen, and reached for my coffee. Through the glass partition of the records office, I could see my colleague Sandra walking toward her desk with a stack of manila folders, nodding good morning at the other staff members as she passed. An ordinary Tuesday morning at the county property office. My phone buzzed. A message from a number I recognized as one of the forensic accounting firm's secure lines. Monthly summary attached. Total documented misappropriation to date, $412,600. Breakdown by transaction in the attached file, $412,000. I thought about my father's notes, the smile that hadn't moved. I thought about the deadline 47 days out, when the trust clock expired, and every protection my father had built would become finally and completely mine to use. I put the phone face down on the desk and went back to work. Arthur Reeves had been tending the east garden of the Caldwell estate for 11 months. This was by any reasonable measure an unusual arrangement for a man who had spent 23 years on the federal bench and had once sentenced a sitting state senator to 14 years for racketeering. But Arthur had always maintained that the law at its best was simply a system for protecting people who could not protect themselves, and that the tools available for that protection were considerably broader than most people assumed. When he had proposed the arrangement, I had looked at him for a long moment across the table in his downtown office. "You want to be my gardener," I had said. "I want to be present," he had said, "close enough to observe, invisible enough to be underestimated." He had paused. "Marcus won't look twice at an old man with a rake. People like Marcus never do." He had been right about that. It was a Tuesday, 6 days after the morning of the breakfast, and I came home from the office to find Arthur exactly where I expected to find him, crouched near the low stone wall that bordered the east garden, doing something methodical and unhurried to a row of gardenias that my mother had planted the spring before she died. He was wearing the wide-brimmed canvas hat he favored for afternoon work, and his hands moved through the soil with the practiced patience of someone who had long since made peace with tasks that could not be rushed. Marcus's car was not in the drive. He had a dinner meeting with the Meridian Group that would run until 9, which meant we had the better part of 3 hours. I changed out of my work clothes, poured 2 glasses of iced tea, and walked out through the back door. Arthur looked up when he heard the screen door and accepted the glass without comment. He took a long drink, set it on the wall beside him, and went back to the gardenias. "Eleanor was watching from the upstairs window when I arrived," he said without looking up. "She watched for about 12 minutes and then lost interest." "She usually does," I said. "She thinks you're the most boring person on the property." "Good." He pulled a weed from the base of one of the plants and examined it briefly before discarding it. "How was the office?" This was how we spoke to each other when we were outside in the open, within theoretical earshot of whoever might be passing. The words were about nothing. The information was in the pauses, the particular emphasis, the things said between the lines of ordinary conversation. "Quiet," I said. "I flagged another transfer this morning, Harbor Island Unit, 640. Arthur nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was filing information away rather than responding to it. "He's accelerating," he said. "The monthly total for the past 30 days is $340,000. I kept my expression neutral. "That's the highest single month yet." "He's under pressure." Arthur moved along the row of gardenias unhurried. "The Miami creditors have been in contact again. One of my sources confirmed it last week. They've extended the deadline twice already. They won't extend it a third time." I looked out across the garden. The late afternoon light was coming in low and golden through the live oaks along the property line, the kind of light that made everything look more peaceful than it was. "He's stealing faster because he's running out of time," I said. "Yes." Arthur straightened up slowly, one hand on his lower back, performing the careful movements of an old man for the benefit of anyone who might be watching. "Which means he's also making mistakes faster. 3 of the last 5 transfers have documentation errors that a first-year auditor would catch." He paused. "He's not being careful anymore. He's being desperate." Desperate men made the kinds of mistakes that ended careers and began prison sentences. My father had told me that once a long time ago in the context of a business negotiation that I had long since forgotten. The principle had stayed. "The loop," I said. "Is it ready?" Arthur picked up his glass of iced tea. "The Bayside Drive unit is prepared. The listing went live through the Trust LLC last Thursday. If he follows the pattern, he'll receive the acquisition recommendation from the board within the next 10 days. He glanced at me sideways. "The board being you." "The board being me," I confirmed. He almost smiled. It was the closest Arthur came to expressing satisfaction, that almost smile, a slight shift in the line of his mouth that lasted less than a second, and meant everything. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the way people do when they have known each other long enough that silence requires no filling. A mockingbird was working through its repertoire in the oak trees. Somewhere on the far side of the house, a sprinkler came on. "There's one more thing," Arthur said. He reached into the front pocket of his worn canvas workshirt and produced a small object that he set on the stone wall between us without ceremony. A USB drive, black and unremarkable about the length of my thumb. "The decryption finished last night," he said. He did not look at it. "The final security layer your father built around the audio files took longer than I expected. He was thorough." A pause. "He was always thorough." I looked at the USB drive. "I haven't listened to any of it," Arthur said. "I told you before, and I want to be clear, I have not listened to a single second of what's on that drive. Your father made that backup for you. Not for me. Not for any court." He picked up his gardening gloves from the wall and pulled them back on. "Whatever is on it, it belongs to you. When you decide you're ready." I picked up the USB drive and held it for a moment. It was lighter than it had any right to be given what it contained. 5 years of questions, 14 months of searching for a password, 8 months of decryption, the last recording of my father's voice. And at the end of it, according to what Arthur had told me the day he first found the backup, something else entirely. Something that explained the choice Marcus had made on the side of a road 5 years ago in the dark while my parents' car burned. I closed my fingers around it. 41 days, I said. Arthur bent back down to his gardenias. 41 days, he agreed. I walked back inside through the screen door, past the kitchen where my grandmother's table sat in the late afternoon light, up the stairs to the bedroom. I shared with a man who had no idea that the woman folding laundry and filing paperwork, and absorbing his mother's contempt with apparent passivity, had been for the past 5 years the most dangerous person in his life. I put the USB drive in the locked drawer of my nightstand. I was not ready yet, but I was getting there. Day 35. The Hillsborough County Property Appraiser's Office occupied the 4th floor of a government building on East Kennedy Boulevard that had been constructed in the 1970s and renovated twice since then without ever quite losing the particular institutional quality of its original design. The hallways were wide and fluorescent lit. The carpet was a shade of gray that had probably been chosen specifically because it would not show wear. The cubicles were divided by low partitions that gave the impression of privacy without actually providing any. I had worked here for 4 years and 8 months. I knew which fluorescent light above the break room flickered at exactly 2:17 every afternoon. I knew that Sandra kept her lunch in the 3rd shelf of the communal refrigerator and would never admit that she had eaten someone else's yogurt on a Thursday in March 2 years ago. I knew that the building's network had a secondary server room on the 2nd floor that most of the staff didn't know existed, accessed by a key card that had been issued to me on my first day and which I had never once mentioned to anyone. I knew a great many things about this building that I had never been asked about. I arrived at 7:45, 45 minutes before my official shift began. This was not unusual. I was known in the office as someone who kept early hours and quiet habits, the kind of employee who generated no friction and required no management. Sandra had once described me to a new hire as the most reliable person in the building. Honestly, you wouldn't believe it. She had meant it as a compliment. She had no idea how precisely accurate she was. I logged into my primary workstation and processed the morning queue: 14 property transfer documents, 2 assessment appeals, one subdivision plat requiring cross-referencing with the county GIS database. Standard work handled efficiently filed correctly. I was done by 9:15. Then I opened the secondary application. It ran in a window that looked to anyone glancing at my screen like a standard document management interface, the kind of thing records processors use dozens of times a day. The window was not, however, connected to the county's document management system. It was connected to a private encrypted server that Arthur had helped me establish through a data security firm in Atlanta 2 years ago, accessible only through a rotating authentication code that changed every 72 hours. The email account it contained was registered to a domain that did not exist in any public directory. CLT-dashboard at caldwelllegacytrust.com. I had been the sole operator of this account for 3 years and 4 months. I pulled up the draft I had been composing over the past week and read through it one final time. The language was formal, precise, the specific register of institutional authority that I had learned from watching my father run his business for the better part of my childhood. Brief, direct, unambiguous. To Marcus Caldwell, Chief Operations Officer from Caldwell Legacy Trust Board of Directors, Reacquisition Directive, Bayside Drive Property. Following a review of current portfolio performance and market conditions in the South Tampa corridor, the board has identified an acquisition opportunity consistent with the trust's growth objectives. Please review the attached property summary for 1847 Bayside Drive and prepare a formal recommendation within 10 business days. Standard acquisition protocol applies. Board approval will be expedited upon receipt of recommendation. There was no signature beyond the board designation. There never was. In 3 years, Marcus had never once questioned this. He had never asked to speak to a board member directly, never requested a meeting, never pushed for any personal contact beyond the email correspondence. This was not, I had come to understand, because he was incurious. It was because the arrangement suited him. A faceless board that trusted his judgment and never looked too closely at his methods was precisely the kind of oversight he preferred. He had no idea that the oversight had been looking very closely indeed from the very beginning. I sent the email at 9:22 in the morning. The response came at 11:47 while I was eating lunch at my desk. Thank you for the directive. I have reviewed the Bayside Drive summary and will prepare the formal recommendation by end of week. Initial assessment is highly favorable. This property represents an excellent fit with current portfolio strategy. Best, Marcus Caldwell, C.O. O. Caldwell Legacy Trust Management. I read it twice. He had written current portfolio strategy, as though he had one, as though the strategy were something he had developed and owned, rather than something he was executing on behalf of a beneficial owner he had never met and would never, in the version of events he had constructed for himself, ever need to meet. The Bayside Drive property was a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom condominium on the 14th floor of a building 2 blocks from the waterfront. It had been listed under the Caldwell Legacy Trust, LLC 3 weeks ago, at a price point specifically calibrated to be attractive to someone looking to make a quick acquisition with untracked funds. The unit was real. The listing was legitimate. Everything about it was completely genuine, including the fact that it was already mine. I had owned it since 2021 when I had purchased it as part of a portfolio expansion using trust income that Arthur had managed on my behalf. It was Unit 1407, assessed at $890,000, generating $4,200 a month in rental income from a tenant named Dr. Patricia Ewan, who paid on time every month and had never once been late. Marcus was about to recommend that the Caldwell Legacy Trust acquire a property that the Caldwell Legacy Trust already owned. He was going to use embezzled funds from the Caldwell Legacy Trust operating account to do it. He was going to submit the transaction paperwork to the Hillsborough County Property Appraiser's Office for processing, and I was going to be the one who processed it. I closed the encrypted application, cleared the authentication session, and finished my lunch. Through the glass partition, Sandra was walking back from the break room with a mug of coffee and a small packet of crackers, moving with the comfortable, unhurried rhythm of someone who had nowhere more urgent to be. She caught my eye through the glass and gave a small wave. I waved back. At 3:45, I sent a single encrypted message from my personal phone. It read, "He took the bait. Be ready." The response came back in under 2 minutes. "Ready. Standing by." I put the phone in my desk drawer and went back to work. The 14th floor of the Bayside Towers had a view that Marcus described standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows with his hands in his pockets and his chin lifted at the particular angle he adopted when he wanted to appear as though he were appraising something rather than being impressed by it as solid investment-grade real estate. Vivian stood slightly behind him and said nothing. She had learned over the course of 22 months that Marcus preferred an audience to a conversation. He did not want her opinion on the view, or the finishes, or the ceiling height, or the location. He wanted her presence, specifically the quality of her attention, the way she directed it at him, with what he read as admiration, and what was in fact a form of very careful listening. She was always listening. 1407, Marcus said, still looking out the window at the Tampa Bay waterfront gleaming in the afternoon sun. Corner unit. 2-bed, 2-bath. The board identified it as an acquisition target last week. He turned and walked toward the kitchen, running a hand along the quartz countertop. I pushed it through fast. When I see an opportunity, I move. Vivian made a sound of approval. She had a gift for sounds of approval. It was one of the things she had discovered about herself during this particular chapter of her life, that she was considerably more capable of performance than she had previously understood. She had been, before all of this, a fairly ordinary person. A marketing coordinator at a mid-size hotel group, quietly drowning in a debt that had started as a business loan for a venture that failed and had grown through a combination of compounding interest and her own inability to look at numbers that frightened her into something that controlled her sleep and her appetite. And the first 30 seconds of every morning when she woke up and remembered. And then Tegan had sat down across from her at a corner table in a coffee shop on Bayshore Boulevard and placed a folder on the table between them. The memory surfaced the way it often did when Vivian found herself in Marcus's orbit, a kind of internal recalibration, a reminder of the actual coordinates of the situation. The folder had contained a complete accounting of her debt. Principal interest fees, the name of the lending company, the payment schedule, the consequences of default, as outlined in the fine print of a contract Vivian had signed without reading carefully enough. Tegan had presented it without drama, without any indication of how she had obtained it, without anything other than a kind of measured directness that Vivian would come to recognize as the woman's fundamental mode of operation. "I know this is your situation," Tegan had said. "I'm not here to threaten you with it. I'm here to offer you a way out of it." Vivian had looked at the folder for a long moment. Then she had looked at Tegan. "What do you need from me?" she had asked. What Tegan needed, as it turned out, was relatively straightforward. Vivian was to allow Marcus to believe that their relationship was developing naturally, which it more or less was, since Marcus had pursued her with the focused intensity he brought to most acquisitions. She was to encourage gently, and without appearing to encourage his tendency toward financial recklessness. She was to document thoroughly and consistently everything he said to her about money, about the properties, about his plans. "I'm not asking you to destroy him," Tegan had said. "I'm asking you to let him destroy himself. He'll do it either way. I just need a witness." Vivian had agreed. She had not expected in the months that followed to find the work as straightforward as it turned out to be. Marcus required very little encouragement in any direction. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life telling himself a particular story about who he was, a story in which he was the protagonist of considerable talent who had been underestimated by the wrong people and was in the process of correcting that error on a large scale. All Vivian had to do was listen to the story. She listened now as Marcus walked her through the kitchen, the living room, the master bedroom with its view of the water. "I'm putting this one in my name," he said, which was not entirely true, but was the version of the transaction he had chosen to believe. "As a personal investment. The board will formalize it through the LLC, but the beneficial ownership stays with me." He had explained this reasoning to Vivian twice before, each time with slightly different emphasis, as though he were testing the architecture of the justification to see where it held and where it didn't. This was, she had come to understand how Marcus processed his own moral flexibility, not by confronting it, but by narrating it in terms that made it sound like strategy. "This place is worth almost 900, he said. "I'm getting it for 850 through the trust account." He turned to her with the smile he used when he wanted someone to understand that they were in the presence of someone exceptional. "That's how this works, Viv. You understand the system, you know where the leverage is. You move before anyone else sees the opportunity." "You're remarkable," Vivian said. She meant it in a way. The capacity for self-delusion at this scale was objectively remarkable. Marcus pulled out his phone and made a call. She heard him confirm a wire transfer quote, an account number she recognized as the Caldwell Legacy Trust operating account, authorize a payment of $850,000 for the acquisition of Unit 1407 at 1847 Bayside Drive. The money would leave the trust operating account. It would arrive in the trust property acquisition account. It would be used to purchase a property already owned by the trust. Marcus would have completed a transaction in which he embezzled nearly $1 million from Tegan to pay Tegan for something Tegan already owned. The forensic accountant had called it, when Tegan had first explained the structure to her, the cleanest, self-incriminating transaction she had seen in 19 years of practice. Marcus hung up satisfied. He looked out the window one more time. "This time next year," he said, "everything looks different." "I believe you," Vivian said. She waited until he went to lock up the unit, and then she typed a single message on the phone she kept separate from the one Marcus knew about. "Transfer complete. $850,000 from operating account." He signed everything. "You have him." She pressed send. Then she put the phone away and smiled at Marcus when he came back through the door, and he took her hand, and they rode the elevator down together in the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other perfectly, which was true for only one of them. The restaurant Marcus had chosen was the kind of place where the lighting was calibrated to make everyone look slightly more important than they were, where the menu arrived without prices for the person who was not paying, and where the tables were spaced far enough apart that conversations could be had with the reasonable expectation of privacy. Marcus valued the expectation of privacy considerably more than the reality of it. He had been coming to Aurelio's on Harbor Island for 3 years, always the same corner table, always the same order, always with the same quality of attention directed outward at the room. The slow scan of other diners that was less about curiosity than about confirmation. He wanted to be seen in places like this. The being seen was part of the point. Vivian sat across from him in the blue dress she knew he preferred, and listened with the quality of attention he had come to depend on, steady and focused and directed entirely at him, as he talked about the Meridian expansion and the Bayside acquisition, and the particular genius, as he characterized it, of understanding leverage in a market where most people were still thinking 3 moves behind. She had been doing this for 22 months. She was very tired. Not of the work itself, not exactly, but of the specific quality of effort required to remain present in conversations that moved entirely in one direction. Marcus did not ask her questions about her life. He had, in the early months, made occasional gestures in that direction, the performative interest of someone who understood that relationships required the appearance of reciprocity. But as the months had passed, and Vivian had continued to be available and attentive and uncritical, the gestures had tapered off. She had become in the architecture of his self-regard a fixture, a very expensive, very agreeable fixture. She thought about the coffee shop on Bayshore Boulevard. She thought about it often in moments like this one as a kind of internal compass check. The folder on the table. Tegan's hands folded calmly in front of her, the particular stillness of someone who had made peace with a very difficult situation and was now simply navigating it with as much precision as possible. Their second meeting had been 3 weeks after the first at the same table. Vivian had agreed in principle at the first meeting, but had spent the intervening weeks looking for the catch, the element of the arrangement that would turn out to be worse than the debt she was already carrying. She had not found one. At the second meeting, Tegan had explained the full picture. Not everything Vivian understood now looking back. Tegan had given her exactly as much information as she needed to do her part correctly, and not one detail more. But enough. Enough to understand that Marcus was not a man who had made some poor decisions under pressure. Enough to understand the actual weight of what he had done and what he was continuing to do. "I want to ask you something," Vivian had said toward the end of that second meeting. "What if I start to feel sorry for him?" Tegan had been quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone searching for an answer, but the silence of someone deciding how honest to be. "Ask yourself," she had said finally, "whether he has ever felt sorry for anyone he hurt." Vivian had thought about that answer many times since. It was not a satisfying answer in the way that clean moral certainty was satisfying. It was something more complicated than that. It was an invitation to look clearly at a person she had spent 22 months in close proximity to and ask a simple question. She had looked, she had asked, she had her answer. Across the table, Marcus set down his wineglass and leaned forward slightly, the posture he adopted when he was about to say something he had been working toward for the length of a meal. "In 40 days," he said, "everything changes." Vivian looked at him. "The trust clock runs out," he continued. "I've been managing those properties for nearly 5 years. When the deadline hits, there are going to be some legal restructuring conversations. The estate attorney's the board." He paused. "I've already had preliminary conversations with a lawyer who understands how these things work, how to position things correctly." "What does that mean exactly?" Vivian asked. She kept her voice neutral, curious, the voice of someone who was interested, but not alarmed. "It means that Tegan's position becomes significantly less secure," Marcus said. "She has no legal standing on those assets. She never has. The trust was set up in a way that made her a beneficiary in name, but the operational control, the real control, has always been with whoever was running the management." He picked up his wineglass again. "That's been me." He believed this completely. She could see it in the quality of his certainty, the way it sat in him, without any visible weight, as though the truth of it were self-evident rather than constructed. "And Tegan?" Vivian asked. Something moved across Marcus's face. Not guilt. Nothing so useful as guilt. It was closer to the expression of someone setting aside a mildly inconvenient consideration. "Tegan will be fine," he said. "She has her job. She has her savings. She's always been practical." He paused. "We want different things. We've always wanted different things. It just took me longer than it should have to be honest about that." He said it with the tone of a man confessing a minor personal failing, the way someone might admit to being bad at returning phone calls. Vivian nodded slowly. "You and I won't have to hide anymore," Marcus said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. 40 days, Viv. Just 40 days. She looked at his hand on hers. 22 months of Tuesday reports. 22 months of weekly encrypted messages to a contact saved in her phone under the name of a restaurant she had never been to. 22 months of being in the same room as a man who had made a phone call on the side of a road 5 years ago and made a choice so cold and so deliberate that she could still feel the temperature of it even now, even here in the warm light of a restaurant where everything looked slightly more important than it was. 40 days, she said. She excused herself to use the restroom. In the third stall from the left, she took out the secondary phone and typed a message. "He's planning to make his move at the deadline. He has a lawyer. He believes he has operational control." The response came back before she had finished washing her hands. "I know. Let him keep believing it." "How is he?" Vivian looked at the question for a moment. Confident, she typed back. "He thinks he's already won." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "Good," came the reply. "That's exactly where I need him." Vivian put the phone away, checked her reflection in the mirror above the sink, and went back to the table where Marcus was already looking at the dessert menu with the comfortable satisfaction of a man who had not one single doubt about how the next 40 days were going to go. She sat down across from him and smiled. Sandra brought the coffee at 8:53, which was 2 minutes earlier than usual because the break room machine had been repaired over the weekend and was now operating at something closer to its intended efficiency. She set the mug on the corner of my desk with the particular care of someone performing a small daily kindness they had never been asked to perform and would never stop performing, and said good morning in the way she always did, like she meant it. "You're here early again," she said. "I had a good night's sleep," I said. This was not true, but it was the kind of untruth that conversation required the social lubricant of offices everywhere, and Sandra accepted it with a smile and moved on to her own desk with the comfortable rhythm of someone who had found their place in a day and settled into it. I had been at my desk since 7:40. The morning queue was lighter than usual, 11 documents rather than the standard 14 to 16, and I processed them efficiently and without particular interest. A residential property transfer in Carrollwood. 2 commercial assessment appeals from the same law firm filed 3 days apart, almost certainly coordinated. A subdivision plat for a new development in Riverview that would require 3 separate cross-references with the county GIS database. Standard work. I did it the way I had been doing it for 4 years and 8 months, carefully and completely, and without drawing attention to the quality of attention I brought to it. Then I opened the secondary queue. The secondary queue was not an official designation. It was a folder I maintained on my primary workstation, populated by a filter I had built into the document intake system 18 months ago that flagged any filing associated with 17 specific entity names. The entity names corresponded to the various LLC's subsidiaries and operating accounts that Marcus had established over the course of his management tenure, some of them legitimate structures within the Caldwell Legacy Trust framework, and some of them considerably less so. The filter had been flagging an average of 3 to 5 documents per week. This morning there were 7. I worked through them in order. A maintenance expense report for the Hyde Park duplex, inflated by approximately 40% above the contractor's actual invoice, which I had obtained through a separate records request 3 weeks ago, and which was sitting in the red folder in my desk drawer. A rental income report for the Harbor Island mid-rise that listed Unit 904 as vacant for the month of October, which it had not been, because the tenant in Unit 904, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Delgado, had been paying her rent on time every month for 2 years and had in fact sent a very pleasant holiday card to the management office in December. I flagged them both, 49th and 50th flags respectively. I kept going. The 5th document in the queue stopped me. It was a property transfer form standard format, filed at 4:47 the previous afternoon, which meant Marcus had submitted it just before the close of business, the kind of timing that was either innocent or deliberate. In my experience with Marcus's filing patterns, it was rarely innocent. The transferring entity was Caldwell Legacy Trust, LLC. The receiving party was Eleanor Margaret Caldwell. The property in question was Unit 6 of the Palmetto Gardens complex in South Tampa, a 2-bedroom ground floor unit assessed at $430,000, currently generating $2,100 per month in rental income from a young couple who had moved in 8 months ago. I read the document twice. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at the water-stained ceiling tile above my desk that I had been meaning to report to building maintenance for 3 months. This was new. Not the mechanism of it. Marcus had been moving assets for years, shifting them between entities, obscuring ownership trails, creating the kind of financial complexity that was designed to be difficult to follow. I had been following it anyway with Arthur's help and the forensic accountant's help, and the particular advantage of sitting in the office where every document eventually arrived. But this was different. Moving an asset into Eleanor's name was not the act of a man managing a portfolio. It was the act of a man preparing for a specific event. It was the financial equivalent of clearing the decks, removing an asset from the playing field before the game reached its conclusion, parking it somewhere he believed was safe. He was getting ready. The deadline was 21 days away, and Marcus was moving pieces into position the way someone does when they believe they understand the board and have already calculated the endgame. He did not understand the board. I printed the document, placed it in the red folder, and picked up my phone. Arthur answered on the second ring. He just transferred the Palmetto Gardens unit to Eleanor, I said. Filed yesterday at 4:47. A pause. Not the pause of surprise, but the pause of a man integrating new information into an existing picture. That's the 14th unit he's touched in the past 6 months, Arthur said. And the first he's moved into her name directly. He's preparing for the deadline, I said. Yes. Another pause. How many flags total? 50 as of this morning. 50, Arthur repeated. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had the particular quality it got when he had reached a conclusion he had been approaching for some time and had finally arrived. Then we're ready. I looked at the red folder on my desk. 3 inches thick, 50 flags, $412,000 in documented misappropriation, plus the $850,000 from the Bayside Drive transaction that the forensic accountant was finalizing her report on now. Over $1,200,000 in total, plus the Palmetto Gardens transfer to Eleanor, plus the audio file on the USB drive in my nightstand at home. 21 days, I said. 21 days, Arthur confirmed. I'll make a call this afternoon. There are some logistical arrangements to finalize. I thanked him and hung up. Through the glass partition, the office was filling up with the ordinary Tuesday morning energy of people settling into their work coffee, cooling on desks' keyboards, beginning their steady background rhythm, the particular ambient sound of an institution going about its business. Sandra was on the phone, nodding, making notes on a yellow legal pad. The young man 3 cubicles down, whose name I could never remember, was eating a breakfast sandwich and reading something on his phone with what appeared to be mild outrage. A completely ordinary morning. I put the red folder back in my desk drawer, locked it, and returned to the processing queue. 21 days. I had waited 5 years. 21 days felt like nothing at all. Arthur's office downtown occupied the corner suite of a building on Franklin Street that had once housed a private banking firm and still carried in the quality of its silence and the weight of its mahogany the atmosphere of a place where serious things happened quietly. He had kept the space after his retirement from the bench, using it for the consulting work he did selectively and on his own terms, and for meetings of the kind that required discretion rather than formality. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon. By the time I arrived at 7:15, it had settled into the steady, unhurried rhythm of a storm that intended to last. I had been in this office twice before. Once, 8 years ago, when my father had brought me to meet Arthur for the first time, introducing him as the man who would one day be responsible for making sure the right things happened correctly. Once 2 years after that, when Arthur and I had sat across from each other the week after my parents died and he had told me the trust clock was starting. This was the third time. Arthur was standing at the window when I came in, looking out at the rain-slicked street below, with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a man who had spent a long time in rooms where the view from the window was the only thing that didn't require a decision. He turned when he heard the door and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. I sat. He sat. Between us on the desk was a manila folder, a legal pad with handwritten notes, and the object I had been told about on the phone that afternoon, but was seeing for the first time now. A smartphone in a cracked protective case. The screen dark, the lower left corner of the casing partially melted, as though it had been exposed to significant heat. My father's phone. I looked at it for a long moment without touching it. How did you find it? I asked. The accident investigator's inventory, Arthur said. Everything recovered from the vehicle was cataloged and held in an evidence storage facility. After the investigation closed, unclaimed personal effects were processed through the county property office. He paused. I filed a claim on behalf of the estate 14 months after the accident. By that point, the phone had been in storage long enough that no one was paying close attention to it. And the backup, Arthur opened the legal pad to the first page of notes. Your father used an automatic cloud backup service connected to his primary email account. It ran every night at 2 a.m., backing up all call logs, voicemails, text messages, and any audio files stored on the device. He looked at the notes rather than at me, which I understood as consideration rather than evasion. The account was secured with a 17-character passphrase and two-factor authentication routed through a secondary email address I wasn't aware existed. How long did it take? 14 months to locate the account. 8 months to work through the security layers. He looked up. Your father did not make things easy to access. He was, as you know, a careful man. 22 months. Nearly 2 years of searching through the digital architecture of a dead man's privacy to find something that might or might not contain what Arthur suspected it contained. What's on it? I asked. Several things. Arthur set down his pen. There are personal messages, family photographs, voice memos he recorded to himself about business matters. I have not reviewed any of that material, and I won't. That belongs to you. He was quiet for a moment. There is also a phone call. I kept my hands in my lap and said nothing. It was recorded automatically because your father had enabled a call recording feature on the device, Arthur said. The call was made at 9:47 on the evening of the accident. Duration 4 minutes and 12 seconds. He looked at me steadily. The recipient of the call was Marcus. The rain against the windows. The particular quality of silence in a room where something irrevocable is being said. He called Marcus, I said. Yes. Arthur's voice remained even, the voice of a man who had delivered difficult truths in formal settings for decades and understood that the delivery was an act of respect. I listened to the first 40 seconds. Enough to understand what it was. I stopped immediately. As I told you, what's on that recording belongs to you, not to me, and not to any process, until you decide otherwise. He paused. But I can tell you what those 40 seconds contained. I nodded. Your father's voice, Arthur said, the sound of the accident in the background, and Marcus on the other end of the line saying 4 words. He did not tell me what the 4 words were. He didn't need to. I sat in the chair in Arthur's office and looked at the cracked phone case on the desk, and understood with the specific clarity of something you have suspected for a long time, and have been quietly preparing yourself to confirm exactly what had happened on a road outside Tampa 2 years ago. Why didn't you go to the police? I asked. With 40 seconds of ambient audio and a theory? Arthur shook his head. I've been in courtrooms for 23 years, Tegan. I know what evidence looks like, and I know what a case looks like. What I had was the beginning of something, not the thing itself. He folded his hands on the desk. And there was another consideration. He looked at me directly. If we move too early with too little, Marcus's lawyers bury it and he walks. He knows we're coming, he has time to prepare, he protects himself. Arthur's voice was precise, measured the voice of someone explaining a calculation they had worked through many times. But if we wait, if we let him continue, if we document everything he does from this point forward, every theft, every manipulation, every fraudulent transaction, until we have a case that is so complete and so airtight that there is no angle from which to approach it that doesn't end the same way. He paused. Then we don't just stop him, we finish it. I looked at the phone on the desk. I thought about the trust clock. 3 years remaining. 3 years of living in my own house, under a name that wasn't mine, watching a man who had taken everything from me believe that he was taking more. Then that's what we do, I said. Arthur nodded once. The USB drive I'll prepare for you contains the audio files from the backup, he said. All of them, for when you're ready. He paused. There's no timeline on that, Tegan. When you're ready. I stood to leave. At the door I stopped and turned back. Arthur, I said. Thank you. For 22 months. For all of it. He looked at me with the expression of a man who understood that what he had done was not a favor, but a duty, and that the distinction mattered. Your father asked me to take care of you, he said simply. I intend to keep my word. I walked out into the rain. 2 years later, 21 days from the deadline, sitting at my desk in the county records office, while Sandra typed and the young man ate his breakfast sandwich, and the world moved through its ordinary Tuesday morning. I thought about that office on Franklin Street, and the cracked phone on the desk, and Arthur's voice saying 4 words. 4 words that Marcus had spoken into a phone while my parents' car burned. I had been carrying those 4 words for 2 years. In 21 days, I would finally be able to put them down. The office of Vincent Hale was located on the third floor of a building on West Cass Street that had the particular quality of spaces designed to impress people who did not know enough to be unimpressed. The furniture was expensive in the way that furniture purchased specifically to look expensive. Always was slightly too large for the room, slightly too polished, communicating investment rather than taste. The wall behind the desk held 3 framed certificates that were, if you looked closely enough, exactly the kind of documents that could be reproduced by anyone with access to a decent printer and a frame shop. Marcus was not looking closely. He sat in the leather chair across from Vincent Hale and felt the specific satisfaction of a man who believed he had found exactly the right tool for exactly the right job. Vincent was 53, silver-haired, with the practiced authority of someone who had spent years in rooms where authority was the primary currency. He spoke in the measured cadences of legal expertise, used Latin phrases with apparent ease, and had come recommended through a channel that Marcus trusted because it had never let him down before. The channel was a private members club on Harbor Island, where certain categories of business were conducted in the comfortable understanding that discretion was the primary service being offered. "What I need," Marcus said, "is a legitimate-looking proceeding, a formal will reading proper documentation, the full professional presentation." He set an envelope on the desk. "My wife needs to believe she has no legal standing to contest the asset distribution. She needs to sign the transfer documents and walk away, believing that this is simply how the estate was structured." Vincent picked up the envelope without opening it and set it to one side. "I've handled similar estate matters many times," he said. This was true in the sense that a man who has been stripped of his license to practice law has nevertheless retained the knowledge acquired during the years he held it. Vincent Hale had been a competent estate attorney for 11 years before a series of decisions involving the falsification of probate documents in a case involving a disputed inheritance in Sarasota County had resulted in a Florida bar disciplinary proceeding that concluded in March of 2019 with the revocation of his license to practice law in the state of Florida. He had not in the 5 years since found it necessary to mention this to clients who did not ask. Marcus did not ask. He paid $50,000 in cash, shook Vincent's hand, and left the building, feeling the clean, uncomplicated confidence of a man who had handled something that needed handling. I was sitting at my desk in the county records office when the notification arrived. It came through the formal estate correspondence channel that Arthur had established for the trust, a registered mail notification forwarded to a post office box in my name that I checked twice weekly. The envelope was cream-colored, the return address a suite number on West Cass Street, the contents a single page on letterhead that identified the sender as Vincent R. Hale, attorney at law, with a Florida bar number printed in the upper right corner. The letter was a formal notification of an estate proceeding regarding the Caldwell Family Trust assets scheduled for a date 14 days from now at an address in downtown Tampa, and requesting the presence of all interested parties. I read it twice. Then I typed the Florida bar number into the attorney search function of the Florida Bar Association's public database, which I had access to through the county's legal research portal, and pressed search. The result appeared in under 3 seconds. Vincent Robert Hale, licensed September 2008. Status revoked. Effective date March 14, 2019. Reason: disciplinary action, falsification of probate documents. I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I looked at the letterhead again, at the bar number printed with such confidence in the upper right corner, at the formal language of the notification, at the careful architecture of legitimacy that Marcus had paid $50,000 to construct. He had hired a disbarred attorney to preside over a fraudulent estate proceeding designed to strip me of assets I had legally owned for 5 years. There was a quality to this particular discovery that I had not entirely anticipated. Not surprise exactly. Marcus's judgment had never been the thing I most feared about him. What I had feared was competence, the possibility that beneath the arrogance and the self-regard, there was genuine strategic ability that might have produced a version of this situation I had not prepared for. But this was not that. This was a man who had not checked the professional standing of the lawyer he was paying $50,000 to legitimize his fraud. I picked up my phone and sent a message to Arthur. They just sent the invitation. Their lawyer is Vincent Hale. He's been disbarred since 2019. The response came back in 40 seconds. I know who Vincent Hale is. This is actually better. I'll be there. And Tegan, one more thing. Wear something that makes you feel like yourself. I set the phone down and looked at the cream-colored envelope on my desk. 14 days. I thought about the red folder in my drawer and the USB drive in my nightstand, and the forensic accountant's final report that had arrived by secure message that morning, the total now updated to reflect the Bayside Drive transaction. $1,262,400. I thought about my father's study, and the rain against the windows, and the document I had signed with shaking hands while my mother held on to my hand and wouldn't let go. I thought about a road outside Tampa at night, and a phone ringing, and 4 words spoken into the dark. I folded the cream-colored envelope carefully and placed it in the red folder. Then I locked the drawer, gathered my things, and drove home to the house that had always been mine, where a man who had just hired a disbarred lawyer with his victim's money was sitting in the study that had belonged to my grandfather. Planning the final moves of a game he did not understand, he had already lost. Day 1, 11:53 at night. Marcus fell asleep the way he did everything else, with complete confidence and no apparent difficulty. By 11 o'clock, he was breathing with the slow regularity of someone who had no outstanding debts to a conscience, and by 11:30, the sound had deepened into the particular rhythm that I had learned over 4 years of sleeping beside him, meant he would not surface again until his alarm at 6:45. I lay still for another 23 minutes. Then I sat up slowly, moved to the edge of the bed with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned to be invisible in their own bedroom, and stood. The floorboards in this room had exactly one location that produced a sound when stepped on a narrow strip near the window that I had identified in the first month and had been avoiding ever since. I moved around it automatically, the way you move around obstacles you have mapped so thoroughly they become unconscious. I took the laptop from the bottom shelf of my nightstand and the USB drive from the locked drawer above it. Then I carried them to the bathroom, closed the door, locked it, and sat down on the floor with my back against the cold porcelain of the bathtub. The bathroom was the one room in the house where I was certain there were no listening devices. I had checked every room in the house 14 months ago, after Arthur had raised the possibility that Marcus might have installed monitoring equipment following a period of particular financial anxiety on his part. The bathroom had been clean. It had stayed clean. I checked it every 3 months. I opened the laptop, inserted the USB drive, and waited for the folder to load. It contained 11 files. 9 of them were labeled with dates spanning the 2 years before my parents died. Voice memos based on the file sizes, the kind my father made to himself when he was working through a business problem and found it useful to speak his thoughts out loud rather than write them. I had not listened to any of them. I had been saving them for a time that wasn't the middle of a crisis, a quiet, ordinary evening, when I could sit with them without the weight of what else the drive contained. The 10th file was labeled photographs, and I had looked at those once briefly the week Arthur gave me the drive enough to confirm they were there and to understand that I was not ready to look at them properly yet. The 11th file was labeled simply, "For Tegan." I clicked on it. There was a brief silence, the ambient quiet of a room being recorded, and then my father's voice came through the laptop speakers at a volume I had set as low as it would go while still being audible. He sounded exactly like himself. This was the thing I had been most afraid of and had not known how to prepare for. Not the content of what he might say, not the information it might contain, but simply the sound of him. The specific timbre and rhythm of a voice I had grown up inside of, that had read to me and argued with me and laughed at things I said and called me by the name only he used, Teganbird, from a story he had made up when I was 4 years old and had never entirely stopped telling. He said, "Teganbird, if you're listening to this, then I didn't get the chance to say these things to you in person. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a great many things, and I want to tell you what they are." I put one hand flat on the cold tile floor and focused on the temperature of it. He talked for 11 minutes and 40 seconds. He talked about the trust and the reason for it, not the legal reason which I already knew, but the personal one. He said he had watched Marcus from the beginning with the specific unease of a man who recognized a particular kind of hunger because he had seen it in other men across tables and in boardrooms over 40 years, and he had not known how to tell me without sounding like a father who simply didn't believe anyone was good enough for his daughter. He said he had been wrong to wait. He said he wished he had trusted me with all of it sooner. He talked about my mother, the things he wanted me to know about her, that he had never found the ordinary moments to say the way she had been when she was young. Before I knew her, the woman she had been before she became my mother and his wife, and the person who held the whole structure of their life together with a combination of grace and stubbornness that he had never adequately told her he admired. He said, "I need you to know that you were never a disappointment to us, not for a single day. Whatever anyone in that house tells you about your value or your potential or your place in any of this, I need you to know that your mother and I saw you clearly. We always saw you clearly. We were just very bad at saying so out loud." Then his voice changed slightly, not in emotion but in register, the shift from personal to documentary, the voice he used when he was recording something for the record. He said, "The following is a record of a conversation I witnessed this evening involving Marcus Caldwell, and then the sound of a car door, the sound of an engine, the sound of a Tampa evening in November traffic in the distance, the specific quality of outdoor acoustics, and then impact. I will not describe the next 47 seconds in detail. Some things do not require documentation. Some things are simply what they are, and what they are is enough. What I will say is this. At the 31-second mark, a phone began ringing. The ringtone was the one Marcus used for his personal cell, a default tone I had heard 10,000 times in 4 years of marriage. At the 38-second mark, Marcus answered. My father's voice in the background of the recording said his name. Marcus said 4 words. "Don't answer. Let it play out." Then the call ended. I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time after the file finished playing. The laptop screen dimmed and then went dark on its power-saving setting. The house was completely silent except for the distant sound of Marcus sleeping. I thought about my father's voice saying Teganbird. I thought about my mother's hands folded in her lap in the study, very still. I thought about Arthur saying, "We don't just stop him, we finish it." And about the red folder in my desk drawer and the 50 flags and the $1,262,000 and the 14 days that had now become 13 hours. I was not crying. I was not angry in the way that anger is usually described, the hot, combustible version that needs somewhere to go. What I felt was something colder and more structural than that, something that had been building for 5 years and had finally quietly finished being built. I ejected the USB drive, closed the laptop, and sat in the dark for another few minutes. Then I stood up, unlocked the bathroom door, and went back to bed. Marcus was still sleeping. I lay on my side, facing the window, watching the light from the street lamp outside move through the curtains in the slight breeze, and I thought about the morning. Tomorrow I would wear the white suit. Tomorrow it ended. The deadline, 6:14 in the morning. I had not slept after returning to bed. This was not insomnia in the ordinary sense, the restless cycling of an anxious mind through the same loops of worry. It was something closer to the opposite of that, a kind of stillness so complete that sleep felt unnecessary, as though whatever sleep was supposed to accomplish had already been accomplished by some other process. I had lain on my side watching the light change through the curtains, the slow transformation from the sodium yellow of the street lamp to the gray blue of pre-dawn, to the thin pale gold of early morning. and I had felt each degree of that change with the particular attention of someone who understands they are watching something for the last time. The last morning in this room, Marcus's alarm went off at 6:45. I was already in the bathroom. I had been standing at the mirror for roughly half an hour by that point, not in the way of someone trying to make a decision, but in the way of someone who has already made every decision and is simply taking a moment before the day begins to be certain they remember who they are. The face in the mirror was 31 years old. It had learned over the course of 5 years to arrange itself in the particular neutral expression that Marcus and Eleanor read as passivity, and which was in fact something considerably more deliberate than that. It was the face of someone who had understood very early that the most dangerous thing she could do in this house was let anyone see what she was thinking. It had served its purpose. Today it could rest. I opened the closet, moved past the section of clothes I had worn for 5 years, the sensible blouses and the unremarkable skirts, and the 3 pairs of flat shoes that Sandra had once described as very practical, and reached to the very back where a garment bag had been hanging untouched since I had brought it home 3 years ago, and hung it there against the day I had known in some precise and unhurried part of myself was eventually coming. I unzipped the garment bag. The suit was white. Not cream, not ivory, not the off-white that hedge against the commitment of a true color. White. A structured blazer and straight-leg trousers in a fabric that held its line without effort, with a quality of tailoring that came from a shop on Henderson Boulevard, where I had walked in one afternoon 3 years ago and spent 40 minutes with a woman named Christine, who had measured me carefully and asked no unnecessary questions, and produced 6 weeks later something that fit as though it had been made for the specific occasion of a day I had not yet told anyone about. I dressed carefully. When I was done, I stood in front of the mirror again and looked at myself for a moment. This, I thought, was what I actually looked like. Marcus knocked on the bathroom door at 7:03. "Tegan." His voice had the compressed impatience of someone who had somewhere to be, and had calculated correctly that I would require reminding of this. "We need to leave by 8:30. Don't make this take longer than it needs to." "I'll be ready," I said. I heard him move away down the hallway, the particular rhythm of his footsteps on the hardwood, that I had memorized the way you memorize anything you have lived with long enough that it becomes part of the ambient texture of your days. I did a final check. The red folder was in my bag, 3 inches thick. 50 flags, $1,262,000 in documented misappropriation, plus the Bayside Drive transaction the forensic accountant had finalized at 11:47 the previous evening, bringing the total to $2,112,400. The certified copies of the 22 property deeds, each bearing my name, and the date, March 15, 2020, were in a separate section of the folder, organized by property address. Arthur's formal documentation of his legal authority as trustee was in a third section notarized and certified by the Middle District Federal Court. My phone showed 3 messages. From Arthur, sent at 6:51, already in the building. 2nd floor lobby. Take your time. Everything is in place. From Vivian, sent at 7:02. Ready. Just say the word. From the forensic accountant, sent at 6:38. Final report delivered to Arthur by secure courier this morning as requested. Good luck today. I typed a single reply to each of them. To Arthur, thank you for everything. To Vivian, thank you for everything. To the forensic accountant, thank you for everything. Then I put the phone in my jacket pocket and walked out of the bathroom. Marcus was in the hallway, jacket on, portfolio in hand, projecting the focused energy of a man on the morning of a significant event. He looked at me. His eyes moved from my face to the suit and back again, and something shifted in his expression, not quite unease, but something adjacent to it, the faint register of a thing that doesn't fit the picture he has been carrying. White, he said. Yes, I said. It's a legal meeting, Tegan. Not a... I know what it is, I said. I walked past him to the staircase. Eleanor was already in the front hall when I came down, dressed in the charcoal Chanel she reserved for occasions she considered important. her handbag positioned on her arm with the careful precision of someone who understood that accessories were a form of argument. She looked at the white suit, and her expression completed a brief, unflattering journey before settling into something dismissive. "Interesting choice," she said. "Thank you," I said. I opened the front door and walked out into the morning. The air was clean and cool, the particular quality of a Tampa November morning, before the heat of the day had established itself, and the live oaks along the drive cast long shadows across the gravel in the early light. I walked to the car without looking back at the house. I had been looking at it for 5 years. I had what I needed from it. In the car on the drive downtown, Marcus talked about the meeting with the focused certainty of a man narrating his own victory in advance, the legal structure, the documentation Vincent had prepared, the expected sequence of events. He spoke with the ease of someone who had rehearsed a thing so many times it had started to feel like memory rather than anticipation. I looked out the window at the city moving past and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. We were 3 blocks from the building when my phone buzzed once, a message from Arthur. "He's here. Vincent is here. They're both already upstairs." I put the phone away. 2 blocks. 1. We pulled into the parking structure, and Marcus found a space on the second level and turned off the engine and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, the posture of someone taking a breath before something significant. He turned to me. "Tegan," he said. There was something in his voice I had not heard before, or perhaps something I was hearing differently this morning, a thin edge beneath the confidence that might have been there for a long time. "Whatever happens in there, I want you to know that I never thought you were nothing. I just thought you were someone who didn't want the things I wanted." I looked at him. "I know exactly what you thought," I said. I got out of the car and walked toward the elevator without waiting for him. What happens next is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Before I take you there, comment 13 below. It's a small thing, but it tells me something important, that you stayed, that you listened, that you're ready for the truth, along with Tegan. Please note portions of this story contain fictional elements designed to serve its educational purpose. If you'd rather not continue, this is the perfect place to pause, but if you're staying, hold on tight. The deadline. 10:02 in the morning. The conference room on the 12th floor had been chosen by Marcus, which meant it had been chosen for effect. It was the kind of room that communicated authority through accumulation. The long mahogany table that seated 12, the framed prints of Florida coastal landscapes, positioned at intervals along the walls. With the regularity of institutional decor, the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the downtown Tampa skyline and the distant silver of the bay. The building itself was one of the more expensive addresses in the central business district. The sort of place where serious transactions happen between serious people, and Marcus had reserved the room for 3 hours at a rate I knew from the building's published schedule was $450 per hour. He had paid for it with the Caldwell Legacy Trust operating account. He had paid for the room where he intended to strip me of the Caldwell Legacy Trust with money belonging to the Caldwell Legacy Trust. I noticed this the way I had come to notice all of Marcus's financial decisions over the past 5 years, with a kind of exhausted appreciation for the consistency of the pattern. Marcus and Eleanor were already seated when I arrived. Marcus at the head of the table, with the specific placement of a man who had thought carefully about where the head of the table was and made sure to occupy it. Eleanor to his right, with her handbag on the table in front of her like a prop in a scene she had rehearsed. Vincent Hale stood near the windows in a suit that was doing its best arranging papers on the credenza with the focused busyness of someone who needed to appear occupied. The room smelled of fresh coffee and the particular brand of wood polish the building's cleaning service used. Through the windows, a cargo ship was moving slowly across the bay, in the middle distance, unhurried and enormous, going about its business with complete indifference to anything happening on the 12th floor. I took a seat near the door, not at the foot of the table, which was where Marcus had clearly expected me to sit, the position that would have placed the length of the table between us and established spatially the dynamic he had designed the room to communicate. I chose a chair along the side three seats from the end close to the exit, with a clear line of sight to everyone in the room. Marcus looked at this choice and said nothing. Eleanor looked at my suit and said nothing. Vincent cleared his throat and began. He was good at the performance of it, I had to grant him that. Whatever else Vincent Hale had lost in the disciplinary proceeding that ended his career. He had retained the cadences of professional authority, the measured pace of legal language delivered with the confidence of someone who expected to be believed. He introduced himself as the estate attorney of record, referenced the documentation he had prepared, and began outlining the structure of what he described as the formal distribution of the Caldwell family trust assets, as specified by the terms of the original trust instrument. The document he described bore no relationship to any trust instrument that had ever existed. I listened to all of it without expression. Marcus watched me listening without expression, and I could see in the particular quality of his attention that my stillness was registering as something other than what he had anticipated. He had expected, I suspected, some version of distress. The progressive dawning of comprehension, as the legal language made clear what was happening, the moment of realization, the attempt to object or question or protest that he and Vincent had presumably planned responses for. What he was getting instead was a woman sitting quietly with her hands folded on the table, watching the proceedings with the calm interest of someone attending a presentation they had already read the materials for. Vincent reached the distribution section. Under the terms as he described them all, 22 properties held by the Caldwell Legacy Trust were to transfer immediately to Marcus James Caldwell as sole beneficiary, with all associated income streams, management rights, and equity interests included. The remaining party, identified as Tegan Lee Caldwell, was acknowledged as a former interested party, whose claim had been formally resolved through the terms of the instrument. He slid the signature page across the table toward me. "Ms. Caldwell," he said, "your signature on the indicated line will complete the formal distribution process." I looked at the signature page. Then I looked at Marcus. He had a particular expression that I had not seen often over the course of our marriage, a quality of satisfaction so complete and so close to the surface that it had altered the normal arrangement of his features. This was the face of a man who believed he was watching the final confirmation of something he had been building toward for years. I reached into my bag. I did not take out a pen. I took out the red folder. I set it on the table between us without opening it. Then I reached into the bag again and took out the document that had been in the inner pocket of my jacket since 6:30 that morning, folded into thirds, the certified copy I had been carrying for 3 years against this specific moment. I unfolded it and placed it flat on the table. It was a property deed, the first of 22. The original transfer document for the Caldwell Legacy Trust's primary residential asset, executed and notarized on March 15, 2020, filed with the Hillsborough County Property Appraiser's Office on March 17, 2020, recorded in the official public records of Hillsborough County, Florida on the same date, transferring ownership of the property in fee simple absolute to Tegan Lee Caldwell. Marcus leaned forward and looked at the document. I watched his face. The satisfaction drained out of it the way color drains from something. "This is," he started. "Before you finish that sentence," I said, "I'd like you to know that I have 21 more of those, one for each remaining property. They're all in this folder, along with the property tax payment records for each one going back 5 years, all paid by me, and the county recording receipts confirming that every single transfer has been in the public record since March of 2020. I paused. Anyone could have checked. Marcus stood up. The motion was fast enough that Eleanor startled slightly in her chair. "This is fraud," he said. His voice had lost its rehearsed quality. "These documents are fabricated. You had someone—" "Sit down, Marcus," I said. My voice was exactly the same as it had been for the previous 8 minutes. Calm, measured, entirely without heat. "Sit down. We're just getting started." He stood for a moment longer, and I could see the specific calculation happening behind his eyes. The assessment of the situation, the search for the angle that returned him to the version of this morning he had planned. He did not find it. He sat down. The door to the conference room opened. The deadline, 10:19 in the morning. The man who walked through the door was not the man Marcus knew. That was the first thing I watched for the moment of recognition. The specific recalibration that happens when a person you have categorized in one way reveals themselves to belong to an entirely different category. It was a thing I had been anticipating for 11 months, since the morning Arthur had first appeared at the East Garden Gate with his canvas hat and his unhurried manner, and his complete willingness to be underestimated by anyone who chose to do so. Marcus saw the face first. I watched it register the slight narrowing of the eyes, the brief interruption of whatever internal process he had been running since sitting back down, the moment of recognition that produced not relief, but the first faint signal of something else. The old gardener. In the conference room. Arthur was dressed in a charcoal suit that had been made for him, I suspected, by the same quality of care that had gone into mine, fitted precisely and without ostentation, communicating authority through restraint rather than display. His tie was a deep navy. His shoes were the kind that last decades if you take care of them. On the lapel of his jacket, small and unobtrusive, was the pin he had worn every day of his 23 years on the federal bench, and had continued wearing afterward because, as he had once told me, some things you earn and carry. He walked to the empty chair 2 seats from me, set his briefcase on the table, and remained standing. The room was very quiet. "Good morning," Arthur said. "My name is Arthur James Reeves. I am a former United States District Court judge for the Middle District of Florida, appointed in 1996, retired in 2019 after 23 years of service." He paused to allow this to settle. "I am also the designated legal trustee and guardian of the Caldwell Family Legacy Trust, appointed by Richard and Catherine Caldwell in 2018, and granted full legal authority over all trust assets and proceedings under Florida Statute 736. He opened his briefcase and removed a document which he placed on the table and slid toward Vincent Hale. "This is a certified copy of my appointment as trustee, notarized and registered with the Middle District Federal Court. The original is on file with the court clerk's office and can be verified by telephone in approximately 4 minutes." He looked at Vincent with the expression of a man who had looked at a great many people across a great many tables and understood precisely what he was looking at. "You may want to review it carefully." Vincent picked up the document. I watched the color leave his face with the efficiency of a tide going out. He read the first page, then the second. His hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady by the time he set it back down. "Mr. Hale," Arthur said pleasantly, "I noticed you were about to leave the room when I came in. I'd encourage you to reconsider that. There are 2 gentlemen in the hallway outside who are aware of your bar license status and would find your departure interesting." Vincent sat very still. Eleanor had not spoken since Arthur entered the room. She was sitting with both hands flat on the table in front of her, looking at Arthur with an expression that was working hard to maintain its composure and not entirely succeeding. She had the look of someone watching a building they believed to be structurally sound begin to show in small and unmistakable ways that it was not. Marcus had not moved at all. He was looking at Arthur with the specific quality of attention of someone who is rapidly reconstructing a significant portion of their recent history and finding that the new version does not resemble the old one in any comfortable way. 11 months of Tuesday mornings. The canvas hat. The gardenias. Every conversation he had had in the East Garden, or within earshot of the East Garden, every phone call made on the back terrace, every exchange with me that had occurred anywhere near the part of the property where an old man with a rake had been apparently always within listening distance. Arthur did not give him long to complete the reconstruction. He reached into his briefcase again and produced a second document thicker than the first, bound with a blue cover page of the kind used for formal legal filings. "This," he said, setting it on the table, "is a comprehensive record of the Caldwell Legacy Trust's asset holdings as of this morning. It includes the 22 property deeds, each bearing Ms. Caldwell's name, and the transfer date of March 15, 2020. It includes 5 years of property tax records, all paid by the trust on Ms. Caldwell's behalf. It includes the county recording receipts for each property." He paused. "It also includes a complete audit of all transactions conducted through the trust's operating account over the past 5 years, prepared by Morrison Financial Forensics, a licensed forensic accounting firm based in Tampa. He set a third document beside the second. The forensic accountant's report, final version, delivered by courier that morning. The audit documents 147 separate transactions in which funds were misappropriated from the trust operating account, Arthur continued. The total amount involved is $2,112,400. The transactions are detailed individually with dates, amounts, account numbers, and in most cases, the documentation that was submitted to government agencies to disguise their nature. Marcus stood up again. This time, it was not the controlled motion of someone making a calculated choice. It was the motion of someone whose body had decided to move before the rest of them had finished thinking. "This is a setup," he said. His voice was different now, stripped of the rehearsed authority it had carried for the past 20 minutes. "You put her up to this. You've been planning this for years, all of you, and this is—" "Marcus?" Arthur's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the specific quality of a voice that had maintained order in federal courtrooms for 2 decades, the kind of authority that does not require volume because it has never needed to establish itself through volume. "I have been in this room for approximately 4 minutes. In that time, I have presented certified legal documentation and a forensic accounting report prepared by independent professionals. I have not raised my voice or made an accusation that is not supported by documentation." He looked at Marcus steadily. "Everything I have placed on this table is a fact. If you have documentation that contradicts any of it, I would genuinely encourage you to present it." The silence that followed had a particular texture. Marcus looked at the documents on the table. He looked at me. I looked back at him with the neutral expression I had been practicing for 5 years, and for the first time in all that practice, it was not an effort. It was simply my face. "There's more," I said quietly. Marcus looked at the red folder still sitting closed on the table in front of me. His jaw tightened. "What?" he said. Not a question, the word of a man bracing. "Not yet," I said. "We're not quite there yet." I looked at the door. Right on time it opened again. The person who came through the door was not Arthur, and was not anyone Marcus had ever seen in a professional context, which meant it took him approximately 4 seconds to understand who she was, and another 2 to understand what her presence in this room signified. Vivienne walked in wearing a gray blazer and the particular expression of someone who has made a difficult decision and is on the other side of it now, past the difficulty and into the territory of simply doing what needs to be done. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm. She did not look at Marcus when she entered. She looked at me and I nodded, and she took the seat Arthur indicated near the end of the table. Marcus made a sound that was not quite a word. "This is Vivienne Marsh," I said. "She has been providing me with documented records of her interactions with you for the past 22 months. The portfolio she's carrying contains printed copies of all written communications between the two of you, all financial transactions you conducted in her presence or on her behalf, and 3 audio recordings made with her knowledge and consent under Florida's single-party consent law." Marcus turned to look at Vivienne. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second, and then looked back down at the portfolio she was opening on the table. "Marcus," I said, and something in my voice made him turn back to me. "I want to walk you through what happened, not because you don't know, but because I want it said clearly in this room in front of these witnesses before we move to what comes next." He said nothing. I opened the red folder. The Caldwell Legacy Trust, LLC, was established in February of 2020 to hold the 22 residential properties transferred to me by my parents before their deaths. You were appointed as operational manager of the LLC in April of that year. You were told you were managing assets belonging to a board of directors. The board of directors was me. I looked at him steadily. "You have been my employee for 5 years, Marcus. An uncontracted, unauthorized employee who was never told the identity of his employer." Eleanor made a sharp sound. I continued. In the course of those 5 years, the forensic accounting firm of Morrison Financial Forensics documented 147 separate transactions in which you misappropriated funds from the trust operating account. These include inflated maintenance invoices, falsified vacancy reports, unauthorized transfers to subsidiary accounts you established without board approval, and direct cash withdrawals from rental income streams. I removed the summary page from the folder and slid it across the table. Total documented misappropriation, $2,112,400. Marcus's hands were flat on the table, very still. The most recent transaction, I said, is what I'd like to explain in some detail because I think it's illustrative. I removed the Bayside Drive file. 3 weeks ago, you received an acquisition directive from the board recommending the purchase of Unit 1407 at 1847 Bayside Drive. You submitted a formal recommendation, authorized a wire transfer of $850,000 from the trust operating account, and completed the purchase. I set the document in front of him. That property has been owned by the Caldwell Legacy Trust since 2021. You used trust funds to purchase a property the trust already owned. The money left the operating account, passed through the acquisition account, and is now documented as an unauthorized transfer bearing your authorization signature. I paused. You stole money from me to buy something that belonged to me, I said. And in doing so, you created the single clearest piece of self-incriminating documentation I have ever seen a forensic accountant describe as the cleanest transaction of her 19-year career. Marcus stood up. He was around the table before Arthur could move 3 steps fast and deliberate in the specific way of a man who has run out of words and reached for something more immediate. Arthur pressed a single button on his phone. The conference room door opened within 4 seconds. 2 men in plain clothes entered with the efficient economy of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment and were not surprised by it. Marcus was stopped, redirected, and seated again with a minimum of drama and no physical harm to anyone. Arthur looked at him. "I've been waiting 5 years for you to make that mistake," he said. It was the voice he had used from the federal bench for 23 years, and it carried all of that history in it, the weight of 10,000 decisions made in rooms where the stakes were someone's life or liberty. It would have been the 6th charge. Please don't give me a 7th. The room was very quiet. Marcus sat with his hands on the table and looked at the documents spread in front of him and said nothing. I looked at Vivian. She nodded once and reached into the portfolio. "There is one more thing," I said. I opened the laptop. Vivian placed 3 items on the table from her portfolio. The first was a printed transcript, 41 pages of text message exchanges between her and Marcus, spanning 22 months. The second was a USB drive containing the audio recordings, 3 of them made on dates she had logged in a separate document she set beside the transcript. The third was a single printed page, 1 paragraph, which she slid toward Arthur without comment. Arthur read it, nodded, and set it face down on the table. The third recording, Vivian said, addressing the room rather than any individual in it, was made 6 weeks ago at the Aurelio's restaurant on Harbor Island. It contains a statement by Marcus Caldwell regarding his intentions toward Ms. Tegan Caldwell following the trust deadline. She plugged the USB drive into the laptop I had opened. Marcus said, "You don't have to. The relevant section begins at the 4-minute 12-second mark," Vivian said, as though he had not spoken. She played it. Marcus's voice came through the laptop speakers with the particular clarity of a close-range recording made in a quiet restaurant. Every word precise and unambiguous, carrying with it the ambient sound of good silverware and low lighting, and the comfortable confidence of a man who believed he was in private. He said, "Once the properties are mine, she's got nothing. I'll make sure of that. She walks away with whatever's in her personal account, and that's the end of it. I've already talked to someone about the apartment. Once the legal piece is done, I want her out within 30 days. Then, 12 seconds later, in response to something Vivian had said, that the recording did not capture clearly. "It's not personal. It was never personal. It was always about what she had access to. You understand that, right? You always understood that." Vivian stopped the recording. Eleanor was looking at her son. Not with the expression she had worn for the past hour, the composed and practiced expression of a woman managing a situation she believed she understood. She was looking at him with something rawer than that something that had come up from underneath the composure when she wasn't watching for it. Marcus did not look back at her. "There is one more recording," I said. "This one is not from Vivian." I navigated to the file on the laptop, the one labeled for Tegan, which contained within it the separate audio segment that Arthur had confirmed in the careful language of a man who had listened to 40 seconds and stopped was the thing it appeared to be. I had separated the segment. 14 seconds. I had listened to it 47 times in the past 3 weeks, enough that I could hear it now in the silence of any quiet room, could hear it when I was doing ordinary things, could hear it the way you hear something that has become part of the permanent acoustical record of your interior life. I pressed play. The room filled with the sound of a November evening 5 years ago. Traffic in the distance. Wind. The specific ambient quality of a recording made outdoors near a road. My father's voice saying a name. Marcus. And then Marcus's voice close to the phone, very calm, the voice of a man making a decision he had already made before the question arose. "Don't answer. Let it play out." Then silence. 14 seconds total. The room was absolutely still. Eleanor made a sound that I had not heard her make before, in 4 years of living in the same house with her, a sound that came from somewhere that had nothing to do with composure or management, or the careful architecture of how she presented herself to the world. It was the sound of a woman who had just understood something about her son that she could not ununderstand. She put both hands over her mouth. Marcus had not moved since the recording began. He was sitting with his eyes on the table in front of him, and I watched him the way I had watched him for 5 years, carefully and without sentimentality, and I saw in the particular quality of his stillness that there was nothing left to calculate. The thing that had kept him moving, the constant forward momentum of a man who believed the next move was always available, had stopped. There was no next move. Arthur stood. He picked up his phone and stepped to the windows, and I heard him speaking quietly in the specific register he used for official communications, identifying himself, providing a case reference number I recognized as one he had filed with the federal prosecutor's office 3 weeks ago, confirming that the evidentiary material was now complete and available for collection. I closed the laptop. I put the red folder in my bag. I stood, straightened my jacket, and looked at the room one final time. Marcus at the table, Eleanor with her hands over her mouth. Vincent Hale examining a point on the wall with the focused attention of a man who had decided that invisibility was his best remaining option. The two men in plain clothes standing near the door. Vivian closing her portfolio with the quiet efficiency of someone completing a task she was glad to have finished. And Arthur at the windows, his back to the room, speaking in a low, steady voice into his phone, doing what he had promised my father he would do. I picked up my bag. "Arthur," I said. He turned. "Please make the call. I think we're done here." I walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the hallway. Behind me, the conference room was silent. I did not look back. 6 weeks later. The house was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Not the quiet of early morning before anyone else had risen, or the quiet of a room just vacated, both of which carried within them the implication of people who would return. This was a different quality of silence entirely. The silence of a space that had been returned to its original owner after a long and complicated absence and was still in the process of remembering what it was supposed to sound like. I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and looked out at the east garden. Arthur was there as he had been most mornings for the past 6 weeks, moving between the gardenias with the same unhurried patience he had always brought to the work. He was not pretending anymore. There was no canvas hat, no performance of age and inconsequence. He was simply a man who had discovered somewhere in the course of 11 months of genuine gardening that he had a talent for it and found it more satisfying than he had expected. He had told me this one evening last week with the mild surprise of someone reporting an unexpected development, and I had laughed for the first time in longer than I could immediately calculate. and the sound of it in the quiet house had surprised us both. The weeks following the meeting had moved with the particular efficiency of processes that have been carefully prepared for. Marcus had been arrested the afternoon of the deadline in the parking structure of the downtown building before he reached his car. The charges, as filed by the federal prosecutor's office with the documentation Arthur delivered that afternoon, were extensive: wire fraud, embezzlement, misappropriation of trust assets, unauthorized practice of law by proxy relating to his engagement of Vincent Hale, and the charge that carried the most weight, the one that had required 5 years of preparation and 14 seconds of audio to support criminal facilitation of a death relating to the phone call made on a road outside Tampa on a November evening 5 years ago. Vincent Hale had been arrested the same day. His charges were narrower but sufficient. Eleanor had received a formal notice of eviction from the Caldwell estate 7 days after the meeting generated by Arthur in his capacity as trustee, and delivered by a process server on a Tuesday morning while she was having breakfast at the kitchen table that had belonged to my grandmother. She had called me 4 times between the notice and her departure. I had not answered. She had left the property on the 8th day with 3 suitcases and the Chanel handbag, and very little else, because very little else in the house had ever belonged to her. Vivian had moved to Seattle the week after the meeting. I had wired the final payment to her account the same day, the amount that cleared her debt entirely, with enough remaining to constitute something closer to a beginning than an end. She had sent me a single message from the airport. It said, "Thank you for seeing something in me worth using." I had read that message several times, uncertain whether it was the saddest or the most honest thing anyone had said to me in recent memory, and had decided eventually that it was both and that both could be true without contradiction. Arthur came in through the back door at 9:15, wiping his hands on the work cloth he kept folded in his back pocket, and accepted the cup of coffee I held out to him with the ease of someone who had stopped being a guest in this house and become something harder to categorize. "The prosecutor's office called this morning," he said. "I know. They called me too." The preliminary hearing had been set. The evidence package Arthur had delivered was, according to the assistant prosecutor who had called me the previous Thursday, one of the most comprehensively documented cases of financial fraud and criminal facilitation her office had received in 11 years of practice. She had said this with the professional appreciation of someone who understood the work that went into building something that thorough, and I had thanked her and hung up and sat for a while in the quiet kitchen, thinking about 5 years of Tuesday mornings and flagged documents and a USB drive that had taken 22 months to decrypt. "How are you?" Arthur asked. It was a question he had taken to asking me in a direct and uncomplicated way over the past 6 weeks, without the hedging that the question usually carried, without the implication that the asking was itself a burden to be managed. He asked it the way my father used to ask it, with the genuine interest of someone who wanted an actual answer. "I'm all right," I said. He nodded and drank his coffee and looked out at the garden. "Your father would have been proud of you," he said, not as comfort, as a statement of fact delivered with the same evenness he brought to all statements of fact. I looked out at the gardenias along the east wall. "I know," I said, and I did know. Not in the way that people say they know things they are trying to convince themselves of, but in the way of something settled and certain. The way you know the things your parents taught you before you understood they were teaching you anything. I finished my coffee. "I'm going to see them today," I said. Arthur set down his cup. "I know," he said. "Take your time." 6 weeks later, afternoon. The cemetery was on the eastern edge of the city, far enough from the downtown corridor that the traffic noise reduced to something ambient and distant, a background frequency rather than a presence. The grounds were old, established in the 1880s, and the trees that had been planted along the main paths in that first decade had grown into the particular magnificence of things, given sufficient time and sufficient space. Live oaks with canopies that spread 40 feet in every direction, their Spanish moss moving in the slight November breeze with the slow, unhurried grace of something that had learned over a very long time not to be in a hurry. My parents were buried side by side beneath one of the oldest of these trees. I had not been here since the funeral. This was not something I had decided deliberately, not a choice made and maintained through active effort. It was more that the shape of the past 5 years had not contained a version of this visit that felt right, that felt like the thing it needed to be rather than the thing grief made it when grief was still the primary weather. I had waited without quite knowing I was waiting for a morning, or in this case an afternoon, when I could come here and be simply the person I was without the weight of everything unfinished pressing on the moment. The flowers I had brought were white, ranunculus from the garden center of Dale Mabry, chosen without overthinking it, and then recognized once I was carrying them as the right choice for reasons I did not entirely need to articulate. I crouched down and placed them against the base of the shared headstone. Richard James Caldwell, Catherine Ann Caldwell, beloved and remembered. I stayed crouched for a moment, one hand resting lightly on the stone, which was cool in the way of things that spend most of their time in shade. Then I sat down on the grass, my back against the oak tree, the way I had sat in my father's study as a child when he was working, and I wanted to be near him without interrupting him, close enough to feel the presence without requiring the attention. I told them what had happened. Not all of it, not in the sequential way of a deposition or a report, but the shape of it, the way you tell someone who already knows the important things, the parts they missed. I told them about Arthur in the garden, and the red folder, and the 47 days. I told them about the white suit, and the room Marcus had chosen, and the specific quality of his face when he looked at the deed with my name on it. I told them about the 14 seconds of audio in a conference room on the 12th floor of a downtown Tampa building, and the silence that came after it. I told them about Vivian, who had been braver than she had given herself credit for. I told them about Arthur, who had kept his word completely and without complaint through 22 months of Tuesday mornings in a garden and 5 years of work I would never be able to fully account for or repay. I told my father that he had been right about Marcus from the beginning, and that I wished he had been wrong, not because I wanted a different outcome, but because I wished the truth of it had not cost what it cost. I sat quietly for a while after that. The breeze moved through the oak canopy above me, and the Spanish moss swayed, and somewhere nearby a mockingbird was working through its repertoire with the focused dedication of a creature that has no concept of an audience and performs anyway. I thought about what Vivian had asked me in the coffee shop on Bayshore Boulevard 2 years ago. What if I start to feel sorry for him? I had given her the answer I believed then, the practical answer, the one that served the purpose of the moment. But sitting here now with the stone cool under my hand and the oak tree enormous and patient at my back, I found that I had a different answer. Not a better one necessarily, just a more complete one. I did not feel sorry for Marcus, but I understood in the particular way that distance and resolution allow you to understand things, that what had destroyed him was not something I had built, or Arthur had built, or my parents had built. What had destroyed him was the specific shape of his own hunger, the part of him that had looked at a life and seen only what could be taken from it. That was not something I had created. It was something he had arrived with. And understanding that was not the same as forgiving it, but it was the beginning of not carrying it. I passed your test, Dad, I said, not out loud, just in the way you say things to people who are no longer there to hear them, but for whom the saying still matters. I hope you're proud. I sat for another few minutes in the quiet of the afternoon under the oak that had been growing since before any of us existed, in the company of the people who had loved me well enough to make me strong before they left. Then I stood, smoothed the back of my trousers, and picked up my bag. I did not feel like a woman who had won something. I felt like a woman who had finished something, which is a different thing entirely, and in most of the ways that matter a better one. The path back to the car was dappled with late afternoon light, the sun coming through the canopy at a low angle that turned everything it touched briefly gold. I walked toward it without looking back. I didn't win because I was smarter than Marcus. I didn't win because I had better lawyers or better evidence or a more carefully constructed plan, though all of those things were true. I won because my parents loved me enough to make me strong before they left. And in the end, that is the only inheritance that truly matters. People ask me sometimes whether I regret those 5 years. I don't. But I want to be honest with you because this story deserves honesty more than a clean ending. What happened to my family was family betrayal at its deepest level, the kind that wears the face of someone who sat at your dinner table. I lived inside that betrayal for 5 years, and I want to tell you, do not do what I did. Do not wait in silence when silence costs you something you cannot get back. Do not let the fear of being believed keep you from speaking. I was lucky. I had Arthur and a father who planned ahead. Not everyone has those things. There is a verse I return to: what is done in darkness will be brought into the light. I believe that, not because justice arrives on schedule, but because I've seen what happens when one person refuses to let darkness be the final word. Family revenge is not something I sought. I sought truth. The revenge was simply the consequence of Marcus's choices when he believed no one was watching. But someone was always watching. Betrayal leaves marks money cannot erase. Family revenge, when born from truth rather than anger, is a restoration. If this story moved you or reminded you that patience is not weakness, leave a comment or share it. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next story arrives. Some stories here contain fictional elements to explore real human experiences. If that is not for you, I understand. But if you're staying, I am glad. Thank you for staying until the very end. That's how it all comes to a close. I'm glad you were here. See you next time.